Hi, guys. It's good to be
Hey,
back
Karen.
here again.
Hey, Karen.
This is Karen again, and I have with me Michael and Alex. And our task today is to discuss the nature of symbol and how symbol is related to information becoming reality. How does information become reality, and how is symbol related to that? So, as I was saying to you guys earlier, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how in my artwork, my vision always outruns my skill. I will have an idea of some sort of painting I want to produce, and I get started on it, and I end up with something, but it's not what I started with. It's not the idea. It's not the completeness of the idea that I started with. And when I first started painting, that was a big disappointment. And I'd have to look at that and think, oh, you know, I'm just no good at this. But finally, I realized that I had to take the long view and say, well, if that idea that was in my head is something I actually want to be able to accomplish at some point in the future, I need to develop the skills to get there. So I would go to work and develop a certain set of skills, and okay, now I'm ready. I can produce that vision, but by this time the vision is 5 years old. And I can produce that vision, but in the interim, I've developed lots of new vision. So my vision always outruns my skill. My capacity to generate ideas and goals always outruns the speed with which I can adapt. And I think there's something in that that connects to symbol and how symbol is necessary for us as I'm going to throw it out to you guys and see what you think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think when I think about the symbol, I always think again about Jonathan Pageau's "Heaven and Earth Meeting," and that's what's the symbol is the meeting place of those two things. So there's something infinite and abstract kind of in my conception of the heavenly, and then there's the incarnation, the specific, and the detail down in earth. And for me, it seems like that seems necessary as it relates to vision, because what guides our vision most of all is value, and we won't spend time on anything otherwise, right? We won't even notice it otherwise. For it to even come into our field of vision and to become relevant and salient, it has to communicate something within that field of value. And then the problem with that is that from an informational processing point of view, I think all the value, all the source of all the value is in the transcendent, which is beyond our capacity. So there is this necessity for us to interact with the transcendent, that we need this kind of intermediary structure. We need something, we need a compression of that we kind of bring down into this compression in the symbol. And that kind of gives us like a finite structure to that transcendent value.
Wow.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that ties in with something I was thinking about this morning that I want to tell you guys later, but I want to hear Alex.
Sure. Yeah, I think very much along those lines is what you're saying, Michael. And there's something about art and the symbol that are related to vision. All those are sort of related things. And so when you're creating art, Karen, when you talk about your vision outpacing the reality of what you're producing, I think that's the difference between painting a, I don't know, quote unquote normal painting and painting a symbol. And there's something about painting a symbol that brings that time distance closer to the present moment. So maybe when I'm not saying that your painting isn't symbolic, and it's just that there's maybe a disconnect between your vision of it and then the symbol comes later. The symbolic meaning comes later after you've had time to like process or something. Process it.
That's a very keen insight, because that's very close to what happens to me. I will have an idea in mind of something I want to paint, and then I produce it. It does not accomplish what I want it to accomplish. But if I spend enough time looking at it, and looking at it with other people who are also looking at it, and see through their eyes what they see, I begin to see something there that I was not aware of. And then that helps me to look deeper within and see somewhat of where that came from. Sometimes sometimes I don't think it came from me. Right?
Yeah.
But there is another sense in which painting, the kind of painting that I do, is attempting to paint a symbol. I'm attempting to paint something that has deeper meaning inherent in it than what the picture is. For example, I did a series of paintings of dragonflies, and each painting was 40 inches by 40 inches. So it was just one big dragonfly on this canvas, and each one was completely different and unique. And what amazed me is, over the course of 20 paintings, that dragonfly began to morph into something that was more and more something like a being, more of a being than I mean, not that dragonflies aren't beings, but you know what I mean. There was something more there than a dragonfly, and so I realized that process had started to dig deeper and deeper in me as I was painting and bringing up new things. So, yeah, it is like painting a symbol, and so that connects with what Michael was saying about the meeting of heaven and earth, because I've always had this kind of view of the world that everything I look at has meaning. If I look at it long enough, it just starts to open up into this world of meaning. So a tree or a bush or a rock or a baby, they all just open up, they unfold. And
What do you think that is when you look at something, the difference when you look at something that has meaning when it doesn't, or like that kind of, that sense of unfolding, that further step? Because sometimes you look at the world and that doesn't happen, and sometimes it's suddenly like you start seeing the explosion of the reality behind it. Could you point to anything in your own frame of mind that makes that happen when it does happen?
well, usually there's an intentionality there. If I go back a little bit in my history, when my first husband left me, I was living in Japan, and when that happened, I was alone there. I didn't know very many people because I'd been in Japan for 3 years, and so I was kind of cut off from my family structure and all of that. And for various reasons, we were cut off from other social structure in Japan. And I was very unsure of where my income was going to come from and how I was going to survive and how I was going to get back to the States. And I mean, I had a lot of questions. Plus, I was alone, and I was heartbroken, and he was the love of my life. And I mean, it was a very difficult, huge, I mean, it was like this, it was about every complicated thing that could happen. I had fallen into this world of chaos. And I'd keep getting these images of disaster in front of me. Like disaster would just unfold in front of me. And it was becoming very difficult to manage my thinking. And one day I was walking along, I was praying, and I was saying, God, please help me, because my mind is just going crazy. And this is going to sound a little weird, but I really felt like the Lord was saying to me, the enemy does not know the future. And the enemy is the one that's throwing all this stuff at you. So it's just all made up stuff. It's not real. Focus on me. And so the way that I began to focus on the Lord was everything that I looked at from then on is, I mean, I'd be walking along, my mind would be going off in this disaster thing, and I would see a leaf on a tree. That was the first thing that caught my eye, was a leaf, and I would start thinking about that leaf. Okay, the leaf is the part of the tree that gathers the sunshine, and the leaf is the part of the tree that brings life. And, you know, I mean, I just, whatever, I would start processing this leaf, and I'd be moving along, and there'd be a branch on the ground. Well, Jesus says that he is the vine and we are the branches. And so I just began to focus my intentionality always to, where is God in this moment where he can bring peace and structure my world in a way that I can function, because I still had to keep going to work. I still had to survive. And it trained my mind in a certain way that was just so, it just made my days so filled with gratitude and joy, and to just think about how amazing God is and all that he has created, and the way that he maintains our lives moment by moment. And so I think that was the beginning of when I really began to see that there is deep, deep truth in every single thing that we look at. I mean, even things that are manufactured things, when you start taking it apart and thinking about, I used to like listening to Jordan Peterson when he talks about how amazing it is that we can go flip on a switch and the lights will come on, and think about all the people who have sacrificed to make that something that's possible for us, and continue to sacrifice and continue to go out in the terrible storms and hook up the wires on the line. And I mean, you know, you just, when you head down a path of gratitude, the whole world just unfolds in this really amazing way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sounds like gratitude is a big component of whatever it is, and that's been my own personal experience as well. And there's another element I think of as well as love is, and I think we tend to think of love just in this kind of small way, but I think it's kind of a larger way of being, perhaps, you know, that encompasses our interaction with everything, not just like personal relationships and things like that. But I think there's this quote by Frankl in when he talks about in his book Man's Search for Meaning, where he says that the only way you can know another person is to love them, and that in loving them you see not only who they are but who they could be. So you see there's this element of potential in it, and you also you see your own responsibility to help bring that to pass in some capacity. So it's like you're not only just seeing, so it's like a way of seeing where you're not just seeing the world as it is, but you're seeing and you're also having a realization of, I think, both the effort that God put into it to make it the way it is. So that's where I think where the gratitude comes in, so that you see all this, but then with all that potential, you also see your own responsibility as well in the way you interact with it, to bring something good and beautiful to pass.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that for me, I don't know, love and gratitude are these like key components of that way of vision or way of seeing.
I agree. I feel like my experience of that around gratitude and seeing the unfolding and sort of the being overwhelmed by the miracles just of the mundane, you know, that day-to-day nature, and how miraculous that is. It seems like whenever I've been overcome by those experiences, there's definitely been a sense of gratitude and love associated with it, and compassion. And like, to try to manufacture that or reproduce it is, I think, that maybe the purpose of religious practice, ultimately, to try to remind ourselves of that state and re-enter that state and stay in that state as much as we can, because it's It's awesome. And it's not just a selfish, self-serving, I'm happy when I'm in this state, but there's this, like, I'll be driving to work and meeting people, and I've noticed if I'm in this frame of mind, and I would distinguish between gratitude and appreciation, like gratitude being thankful for what's past and sort of up to the present moment, and then perhaps even grateful for a potential future that you see potential for manifesting, but like appreciation being the actual, as in the moment, unfolding of the moment, and appreciation of that. But so if I'm in that state of mind, I've observed that when I look at other people, say that I pass going to work and they're in their vehicle, and I see their faces in their vehicles, I feel just tremendous love and compassion for these strangers, because I see them as being human, as being like me. There's no essential difference in us. There's no judgment or comparison or anything like that. So it's just this natural feeling of love and compassion that comes up with that appreciation of the moment.
Because we're all sharing in these wonders together.
Yeah, a lot of this conversation too, for me, makes me think about what role God is playing in consciousness itself. This is something that pops into my mind a lot, and in a sense, like when we're choosing to go down this path of vision, it's like we're aligning with something, perhaps like some small slice of how God sees things in some sense. And that's what I often have the sense that this is, again, I think both of you touched on this, like it's kind of outside yourself. You're seeing some greater reality. It's beyond how you would usually see things, and you're aware, like something's opening up to you, something's being revealed that seems beyond your own capacity to have kind of manufactured based on like the small finite list of things you already knew. It seems unlikely that you could have come up with that, but there it is, like confronting you. And it seems to me like maybe that's, I'm not sure exactly how that happens, but it seems to me like oftentimes coming to know certain things is kind of like a remembering of sorts. Like there's a familiarity to it oftentimes. And that seems like, well, how is that possible? Because I know from my own, historical perspective, this is a novel experience, but it feels very familiar. So it's like it makes me wonder in some sense whether that is God's involvement in our consciousness that has these kind of interesting emotions. And also, like you were just describing your ability to connect with a stranger, somebody you don't know, and you have no idea about their life or where they're going, and your ability to feel compassion for them. I feel like that's got to be God, because you don't have enough information, and just a face to go on and have that. But there's like something larger, that's giving you that capacity, that extra capacity.
Yeah, I agree. That's what it feels like. A familiarity. When you talk about transcendent, I like to look at words, and more it seems like, I'm no lexicographer, I'm not that well read, but it's just been really striking me lately when you look at a word and it'll have different meanings in different contexts over time over your own personal time, my own personal sense of time. And something that you were saying about Barfield the other day, I think, Michael, was that words have this history of meaning, and and so that there's some sense that there's a remembering of what a word used to mean, or what a word, of all the different meanings of a word. And when you understand a word in a new way, it's like a very familiar feeling of it, like you knew that all along, and it was just like you're being reminded, oh yeah, that's what that word means, or had meant in a larger context. And but it as far as the word like transcendent, and if we look at that and what that means in different contexts, I think about when we first went into outer space and we saw those pictures of the Earth from outer space, that nothing changed about reality, in the sense, all of us people that were still down on Earth, nothing changed. No new laws of physics suddenly came into existence when there was such a thing as a photograph of the Earth from space. But that removed observational perspective was in some way, was transcendent of what we had been able to see before, from like something, like too close to see what it is, like Mary was saying in your conversation with her and Sherry, that I watched, Karen, that you guys had that conversation. Mary was saying that something's too close, you can't really see it, and there needs to be this distancing away from it in order for you to see it. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that this idea of the transcendent being something that there's this removal or a distancing that allows you to see something through new eyes, but it's not something new necessarily. It's just new to you. But there's something about your being able to observe it then that puts you in this whole other familiarization with reality that's always been there. You just didn't have the perception of it. And when I think about God's perception, or our perception in relation to God, it's like that perception outside of which everything appears totally new, but absolutely the same at the same time.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you're almost talking about, like, I think it was the last time Michael brought up a poem that he'd heard as a child or read someplace about a larger circle. When your perspective gets high enough and your vision enlarges, you're encompassing a larger circle. So those things that were always there were not part of your circle before, but now you can see them because your perspective has gotten high enough. Is that kind of the picture?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, Michael, the poem that you talked about was drawing a larger circle includes more people in the circle of love. Is that?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember, the line was like this. It starts with somebody drawing a circle that keeps the narrator out, and then he draws a larger circle that includes him and the other person that kept him out into that circle. And that
Right away when you said that and you used the word narrator, my mind jumped to that verse that Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. Because I was thinking today about, well, okay, I had this crazy idea. I promised you, guys, I wouldn't go all woo.
That's all right.
But I had this idea. I was thinking about, I saw this video of Stephen Wolfram last week where he was talking about Mathematica, which is his organization that seeks to find the optimal algorithms to make the construction of new more complex, computer processing and so forth. And he was saying that he keeps discovering these beautifully simple formulas, that you take this beautifully simple formula, and when you get it working, it produces an unimaginably complex and emergent pattern. And I thought it was kind of amazing that he didn't pursue that and try to figure out why that would be so. But what he's doing is pursuing the formulas, because it makes the development of algorithms more efficient and more optimal and all of that. And so I was thinking about, wow, so the most simple formulas produce, not necessarily all of the most simple formulas, but that there are some simple formulas that produce immensely complex patterns that are quite surprising. So I thought about that, and I thought, well, wait a minute, an algorithm, I think, is just a method of processing information, or a tool for processing information. Would that be correct?
Yeah. You could think of it just, you could think of an algorithm as a series of steps you take, that are just listed out and that you just iterate over.
Okay, so I thought about that and I thought, wow, you know how Jordan Peterson always talks about ideologies as being an incomplete worldview. And I thought it almost, as a picture for me to work through anyway, I can see that religions, denominations, political ideologies, philosophies, in a sense, are algorithms that are extracting out from the totality of truth a system that can be used for information processing, but they're incomplete. They're very incomplete, and they tend to be very complex. And, well, maybe complicated. They tend to be very complicated. They have a lot of rules and difficult to implement. And they are people who get involved on the inside of them tend to get trapped in too much order, and the results are always incomplete and sometimes catastrophic. But Christianity is very different, because Christianity, I don't want to use words the wrong way here. Christianity is also, Christianity is the totality of truth. And if you thought of, and this is, I don't want to say, if you think of Jesus, if you think of the simplest possible formula is Jesus Christ. He was not a king. He had no power. He had no earthly power. He had no armies. He had no set of rules. But from him, and as the Word, from him emanates all beautiful, complex, emergent processing of truth through the church, which is all the people that are filled with his Spirit, so that it's not rule-based. It leaves open all this possibility for adaptation to whatever society that we find ourselves in, and that it's as though when Jesus was resurrected, that began the building out of reality based on this algorithm, if you will, this method of processing information that's based on the Holy Spirit producing the salience in our minds and hearts of the greater values and the ability to adapt and create and love. And so anyway, I'm thinking about that.
Yeah.
I think well, a couple things that popped into my mind. The first, the incompleteness of the ideologies is that they don't have contact with the transcendent in their model.
Mhm.
So there isn't a way for the model to get updated with something beyond it. It masquerades as being complete in and of itself, and therefore it's doomed to failure from the start. But then, the other thing you were talking about in there, this fittedness or this adaptive quality that comes in with these things, and that to me, that's part of kind of how I conceive of that love I was talking about earlier.
Mhm.
Because one of the things love does, if you think of love, you can think of it in all these levels, and at the higher up levels, you start to become one with the thing that you're loving, right? So your shape of who you are changes and adapts in some way to the thing you love, and that enables for you to fit very closely to it. And there's a self-sacrificial element in that kind of, you could say you're becoming deformed to better fit this thing, like something of you's giving way so that you better fit the thing that you love. And I think that's, in some sense, that's what God is doing for us all the time. Because this is another thing I think about, is what God, what price is God paying for both creation and redemption. And I think that part of it is this ongoing act of love, which is where He is voluntarily becoming, moving on this path towards union with us. Like there's something in Him that has to be, in His infiniteness, that has to become, that is constrained by how it interacts with us. And that's the way His love is manifest in terms of, I think first of all, we don't know what role He plays in terms of maintaining the order and structure of being itself. He may be very, very involved. A lot of people came up with deist models where God kind of created us like a watch and He's off in the distance. But I don't that doesn't ring to me true. I feel like He's much more involved in it. And there may be some ongoing sacrifice of who He is to sustain this, and also, like I was saying earlier, I think He is playing some ongoing act in our consciousness itself. And we don't know for Him to get that close to us, to have that interaction, what that cost Him, is again that fittedness, that self-sacrificial element of love that changes how it is to meet and interact with this other thing where it is.
Mm-hmm. Seems like there's something about consciousness itself, that and awareness itself, that has suffering built into it. And when God separated Himself, or separated us out from Himself, what that meant was that consciousness was created. And I mean, I don't pretend to have any well-formed theological arguments or anything like that, but I just try to look at experience, my experience of the world, and try to be as honest as I can with that. And I think one thing that is helpful is to try to ground things in physical reality, so that we have this. We can hypothesize and imagine different scenarios, like what did God want? What was He thinking about? And what's the purpose of it? But Michael, like what you were saying about this fittedness, I think that there is in a way, that science, which is just like observation of materiality and trying to describe it in what you observe and and predict how it will behave and understand its history of how it behaved in the past and all that, is in some way like the Tower of Babel. Let's say there's this continuous need to try to build upon that and build upon that, to try to move towards this perfect concretized knowledge of everything. And in another sense, there's the latter, which is more like a purely non-material way to get to that same ish place of complete knowledge. And in some way, the two things aren't, to me, they aren't really that separate, in that they both want and don't want the same things. Like the scientist would be, and the materialist would be utterly lost if they knew everything, because life would no longer have any purpose to them. There's no more left to know.
And yet they seem to assume that day will come. It's very strange. They want to make concretized knowledge absolute, and again, that leaves no place for the transcendent. And the thing about the transcendent is not just that it's more than what you can see; it's this kind of this infinite quality to it, that even if you were much bigger and you still couldn't exhaust it. And I don't know if you guys have been following with Vervaeke, but he talks about some certain ideas about this kind of wellspring, this I can't remember the terminology or jargon he uses, but it's like this sense of infinity, like that the source of life that you can draw on and keep drawing on and keep drawing on. That there's and I've had experiences of that as well, like of a sense of like there's this infinite quality to it, and it's overpowering. So it's like, in a sense, as a finite creature, you kind of want to get away from it because it's overwhelming. But you also you have this sense of its goodness, in that that you almost need this, like you were, and so but also that if you were so desirous that you could encounter this all the time, but that we don't want to, because it is overwhelming.
Right. Well, overwhelming. And if I could like paint a little picture about, say, the Big Bang in the beginning, and what, like, as simply as I can paint that picture, the beginning was the beginning of something and nothing, something versus nothing, or something as opposed to nothing, a duality. And that's just like as simple as I can. If I was going to boil everything down to its most basic element, I would say there's something and there's nothing. And in some sense, in that duality, there's a sense that say nothing, no thing in particular, no thing manifest, is this emptiness. It's this void. There isn't anything there. And at the other spectrum of that would be all things. So forgive me if I ramble a little bit, but I'm trying to paint this little picture.
Yeah.
So you have no thing that is at the same time the potential for all things. So all things are in potential. No thing is manifest. And the opposite of that would be all things across all time manifest simultaneously. And with no thing left in potential, all things manifest. And both of those kind of look the same. There's no distinction, right, in either one. no thing.
There's no contrast.
There's no contrast, right? There's no contrast, which means there's no gradient, which means there's no energy, which means there's no consciousness. And at some point, the beginning, the first thing that had to happen was that there was something and nothing, particularized, in this sort of this beginning of this duality out of the non-dual. And it's interesting to me that I've been reading Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, and he's talking about the left brain and the right brain hemispheres, and the difference between those. And so this is the kind of the leap I'm making, is that the fittedness of our brain is somehow fitted to that ultimate nature of being completely engulfed and consumed by the all, which I would call God. And on the other hand, being completely lost at sea in a sea of absolute nothingness, no thingness. And either way, there's no contrast, there's no potential. And so those are both places of fear. Like if I would say, if there was some way in which I feared God, it would be that I would fear being completely consumed, and I would exist no longer. And if there's a way that I feel that I would fear sort of the opposite of that, it would be to have absolutely no thing, no meaning at all. So it's like our minds reflect that, our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere. The right hemisphere being something that we're not conscious of, and the left hemisphere being what we are conscious of. And there's something about the reconciliation of those two aspects, that to bring those two things back together, that is what I think there's something there that in that experience of appreciation and of gratitude, and is present in all of the teachings that I've had experienced from Jesus. That reconciliation, and it kind of makes it sound like, it's a sort of a materialist view, like, well, this is just all the brain, and everything that we feel and long for, and hope and despair and nihilism and all that is just a biological function. That's not what I believe. But at the same time, there's, if we follow the trail of materiality, if we're not afraid to avert our eyes from the trail of materiality into that realm of chaos, to that maximum complexity where we might find ourselves, and not avert our eyes, then those people that are brave enough to do that are, I think, going to have the potential to see most clearly about the nature of how things are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So while you're talking, it's generating a lot of thinking. So that's really good. I'm thinking about something I read in Maps of Meaning this morning, that action leads to ideation, leads to imagination. I mean, imagination leads to ideation, leads to action.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, imagination, and if that gets disrupted, if that is if there's a dissociation in that connection in our lives, our personalities don't develop properly. And so what that made me think about is the discussions that I had with the physicist who was working on robotics and AI and all of that, and this idea that ideas have to be information has to be embodied in some sense. And so this is what we're talking about. How does information become reality? We have the imagination, we see the symbol. The symbol produces some sort of thinking, and it works on our imagination, and then maybe an idea comes out of it. Let's say some scientist has an idea, and his idea looks like a mathematical formula to him. And so he takes that mathematical formula and he works on it a little bit, and let's say Einstein, and out of his discovery of special relativity, we end up with the whole field of quantum mechanics, which without that, we wouldn't have the computer, we wouldn't be sitting here talking, right? So
Yeah.
the imagination was there, became an idea. The idea is put into action by that one person who speaks that idea out into the world, and it's gathered up by others, and through the embodiment of people, it turns into many different kinds of real functional things. But what I see happening now is that a lot of these quantum physicists are kind of getting so up in their heads and coming to the conclusion that actual things, structures, bodies, computers, tables, don't actually exist because they are just quantum particles or whatever is underneath the quantum particles. But I see the world so differently, because what I see is we have all these different levels of reality, different ways of describing the levels of reality, or different ways of, in the simplest way, like quantum particles are just building blocks, and those building blocks are what protons and neutrons function out of, and then those are building blocks for atoms, and atoms are building blocks for molecules, and molecules are hitting each other randomly and building blocks for this table, and for Alex, and for Michael, and for this computer. And it's all existing simultaneously. It's like a built out structure of like a matrix, or like a wireframe that's been filled in. So in some sense, these imaginations over time, and so, how in the scripture it says that God is love, and that's the only time you get this like equal sign between God and a noun. So in some sense, it is God's love that is building out the universe. And I heard a great message yesterday on the church, and how the life of Christ expressed outward in time has, his love builds the church, and the church, not any one denomination, but the church as the body of Christ, is this way of infiltrating, if you will, or entering into this reality that exists, but filling it out, filling in all the empty spaces. They talk about how in quantum physics, almost everything is just emptiness. There's not much there in terms of matter, but there is something there. It's just the part that you can't access through science. The thing that's building out the universe is the part you can't access through science. And that's the manifestation of love, is actually filling up like a honeycomb, filling up the universe. I don't know.
Yeah, we know stuff is there because, I mean, of the even with Einstein's equation, and E equals mc squared, and that one of the discoveries within that equation is how much energy's in matter. Like there's tremendous amounts of energy, like just like almost unfathomable amounts. So that like some very small bit of matter, when we trigger one of these chain reactions, and it can like blow up, just release all this tremendous amount of energy. Like it's and that we think about all the matter throughout the whole universe. There's just, so much of this energy. So it's interesting to me that, again, that because, like you said, it becomes this framework in their mind that is just, kind of, I don't know, ethereal or not real, that comes to some conclusion of things not really being there. Even though we know there's the way matter is structured and everything takes this huge amount of energy to sustain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about
energy goes the other way too. So matter requires energy to be sustained. Wow. Okay.
Well, so and like that, and that's where we get the idea that all the heavy elements in the earth, like all of what we're the organic stuff we're composed of. People always say, "Oh, well, that was forged in a star," because you need the energy of the star to take these simple things like hydrogen and such and build up lots and lots of energy to build into things that are bigger. And so that's those kind of stars were able to forge all the stuff that we see around us. But it was this combination of concentrations of energy that were able to do it.
Yeah, this reminds me of Rupert Sheldrake's concept of these morphic fields, and where he talks about there's some sort of, he calls it morphic resonance or these morphic fields. Kind of like if you imagine these cymatic, they call it cymatic patterns, where you take like sand and put it on the top of a piece of cardboard and put it on top of a speaker or something, and you subject that cardboard and the sand on top to different frequencies, and these really complex but very structured patterns emerge from the interaction of the sound waves and the cardboard and the sand. Wow. And there's a way that, so like Sheldrake is suggesting that everything that has sort of a structure and organization, no matter how simple or complex, is the result of this sort of field of resonance, kind of like the speaker resonating the sand on the cardboard that holds things in their form. And it's obviously not acoustic, but it's a deeper, some sort of deeper form of energy that we have no idea, what that is. But he calls it morphic fields. Mm-hmm. And that really seems like it feels right to me that there's something like that.
Way back in the book of Hebrews, it says all things are held together in Christ. That, I don't think that's an accidental use of language in Hebrews.
Right. I mean, I don't think any of it's accidental.
I mean, why would someone in the first century AD say something like that? Mm-hmm. That's a pretty extravagant claim, that all things are held together in Christ.
Right. Well, just in the creation story, and just the idea or the words that we were created in God's image. I was looking at trying to do some research and see what the word for image that was being used, and they use the word image, and then it's in his likeness we were made, male and female. Mm-hmm. So there's the word likeness and there's the word image. And I was trying to look at the Greek and the Latin and the Hebrew to try to see, try to get some meaning into that, mm-hmm. beyond those English words. And it's really, of course, there's a lot of different ways you could interpret those words. Any particular word, like, these words do have a history, and it's hard to know what the authors meant by those words in their native tongue. Mm-hmm. But there is a way that you could say that image, well, in the Greek is icon, and another meaning of that is shadow. So there's a way that you could look at that as imagination. You know, we were made in God's imagination. So in a sense, that maybe what's the best language that we can come up with, which isn't going to be describing it, of course, but I think it's interesting to think about that everything being held together in morphic fields, or whatever names we want to put on it, is God's image, imagination made real. And when I think about like the quality of my imagination and what I can create in, well, what is sort of comes to my imagination. I don't really know that I can consciously create anything in my imagination, but things emerge. And when I think about trying to like sustain the things that come in my imagination as if they had their own sovereign existence, and to love them, and to want what is good for them, and to, when I imagine myself, like it what God must be doing and how much he must love and care for us to hold us in his imagination, to keep us, to give us this existence, and to give us imagination, to give us our own sovereignty and our own imagination that we can create, that we can use to create or sub-create.
I think it's in Psalm 139 that it says we cannot imagine, or we cannot comprehend the number of thoughts that God has towards us each day. So that's a beautiful picture, Alex, that he, in his thoughts, he is always sustaining us in his thoughts, and that those thoughts are, he is embodying those thoughts in us, giving us bodies to be the action of those thoughts. So in some sense, maybe we are symbols. We are meant to be symbols that unfold a representation of his beauty and his goodness and his creativity and his imagination. And then our sin and rebellion gets in the way and corrupts that image. And the scripture says that the day will come when we are with him, that we will more purely reflect him. The mirror will be cleaned off. Won't be this murky mess that it is now.
Did you guys see recently Paul had a conversation with this guy JP? It's like his second conversation with him about where he's talking about panpsychism.
I wanted to listen, but I can't understand. JP seems like a very interesting person, but I can't, his intonation, I just can't follow him. I can't understand him. So
it's interesting. So one of the things he points out in there, like he was talking about, let's say like you're an author who writes a book, right? And you set out to write the book and you already know kind of like who the chief characters are, you know how it's going to start, you have an idea where it's going in the middle, and then where it's going to end. But he says, within that story, the characters themselves kind of have this freedom to move about. Like the characters in some sense can't change the ending, but there's all these things the character can do that can change. And what made me think of this was Alex talking about, us living within God's imagination, and also the ways in which, like I said earlier, like what God's doing for us all the time is he's loving us into existence. He's seeing where we are, but also our potential, and giving us our kind of own agency within that potential to make choices as well. Even though he's moving things towards some final end. But one of the things that also made me think of, I just realized recently how much when I'm watching like television or other forms of like storytelling, I don't like stories where I can tell that the storytellers don't like their characters. And this is, which is funny. You think that would never happen, but a lot of times, especially long running stories like television shows, they have lots of writers, and the writers change over time. And so you can kind of see it like this kind of evolution where at first, the writers kind of love that character into some sort of life. And then over time, it's just like a tool to accomplish some other primary purpose, right? Like maybe if it's a comedic show, they kind of turn all their characters into punching bags for the jokes. And maybe if it's a drama, they kind of keep twisting them into ever more improbable pretzels so that the dramatic tension can eclipse, what was previously seen in the show in some way. And over time, the character stops having a life of its own, and it to me, it just falls flat. I become immediately disinterested. I'm just like, this doesn't have, the characters aren't real anymore.
Wow.
And what stands in stark contrast to that is long running shows where they don't do that. And I would say, like, I don't know if you guys have either seen The Office or Parks and Rec. Both of those I think were great examples. I didn't watch a lot of The Office, but I watched a good bit of Parks and Rec. But I know enough about the other ones just from popular culture and people talking about it, that there was this kind of long running attachment to the characters, though, even though they were flawed, and their flaws were played for comedic purposes because it is a comedy show. But there was this kind of love and attachment to who that character was and what their potential was, that they continue to have this character arc of growth throughout the show, and they didn't just go back into that stereotypical whatever, embryonic state they started in. And so it like, and with those shows, like the people like were like so sad when those shows ended, because there was something real and solid in those characters that was more important than any of the laughs on the show, that people were really attached to. And
I really,
so it's
really like that. Yeah, there's, I've heard people say about the movies they've made, like directors or writers, creative people painters that create something, they refer to their works as children. They're children, and there's that sense of love that in their creation, and that's in that way, that's how we are in His image.
And I'd say another element you see this in is it's like how much love and attention do the writers give to the bad characters, the ones that are supposed to be bad. I can't stand it when they become these kind of caricatures of evil. Like they serve no other purpose in the story but to be some sort of faceless representation of evil. It's like, well, we don't need a character then, like I don't like that. I think we're a character, like the really great stories, I'd say like say Dostoevsky, they give so much thought and love even to the characters that aren't the protagonists, that are the bad guys, so to speak. And that's part of what makes them such great works of art.
Absolutely. My favorite stories are the ones where I'm highly conflicted about whether I should really like this character or really dislike this character. Right. For sure.
What you were talking about, Michael, too, makes me think about when Jordan Peterson talks about the danger of ideology. because people that get trapped inside of an ideology, they lose all their individuality, and they're no longer thinking or coming up with their own thoughts. They're just parroting the thoughts that
Yeah.
the ideology produces for them, or that other people in the identity group produce for them.
Mm-hmm.
They think they have an idea, but the idea has them.
Yes, the idea has them. That's
Mm-hmm.
right. And it's almost like they no longer have agency to make choices that would differentiate them as individuals. And so they just become part of the group. And that's where the great danger is to ideologies. And that happens because the ideology is an incomplete excerpt from the truth. There may be some truth in the ideology, but it's incomplete. But it's not only incomplete, but it has denied that there is anything else outside. It has decided this is all there is to truth, and we don't need to know anything else. And that's what turns it towards evil.
Yeah, that makes me think of that famous verse in Ephesians, where it talks about resisting the principalities and powers. And I think if whatever I don't really know how to conceptualize the spiritual realm and things like demons and angels and stuff, but like it seems like in this idea of the idea having you, there is you are giving something of your own sovereignty over to something, and how you conceptualize what that something is, it doesn't matter, but it has real power, and we can see that in the world. I mean, you can see it, how it's played itself out in the past, and the way these ideas spread, and they have the kind of agency and life to them that is both malevolent and real, and kind of people get in their grip and can't get out of it, so to speak. But in that series of verses, the iteration over and over and over again is to stand, to resist, to not give over your own whatever sovereignty, whatever that is, in the image of God that you're given, to make your own choice, to see things from your own unique perspective. I think of it to not submit to this kind of this hierarchy or whatever, this limitation, this thing that's kind of in some sense God-like, but doesn't have the transcendent. It has some truth in it. It has something that's attractive and alluring, but it stops far short of what we're really made for.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of I think everything we're talking about is related to how information becomes reality, because I think what we're trying to talk about is but we really haven't talked much about the physical manifestation of ideas. But there's something that is yeah, I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Oh man, I was waiting for that.
Sorry.
That sounded really good.
So the physical manifestation of ideas, there are a lot of different ways that happens, right? I mean, that mathematicians seem to work in this universe of pure thought, and yet some of the discoveries that they make in that universe of pure thought have become very concrete realities that have allowed civilization to move forward in amazing ways. Artists creating sculpture, or architects having an idea and ending up producing, not just producing a building, but producing a way of producing buildings that then manifests itself throughout a historical period of time. There are just so many different ways that ideas become reality.
Yeah.
They all require this embodied action. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm one of these people that I just love getting up inside my head. And I love talking about ideas, but for me to actually enter in and manifest those ideas or those truths in my life is another thing altogether. And
I think it's self-sacrifice that's required.
Mm.
But I mean, in some sense, you are self-sacrificing a bit when you're ideating on your head. You're laying the framework, but then there is that extra step, like you said, to embody it, and it requires your time, attention, all these things to bring it into reality.
Yeah. So I was talking to my husband the other day because he is one of these guys. He just is a doer. He doesn't sit around thinking about a lot of stuff. I mean, obviously, he's always thinking about his work and how to make things work for his work. But he gets a little impatient with the kinds of things that we talk about here because what's that going to make? You know, what's that going to become?
Yeah.
And when he wakes up in the morning, he does his 30 push-ups. He goes for his little run. He comes back. He reads the Bible. He gets at his job. He does his work all day. He fixes things around the house before I can even think that they need to be fixed. And, he just do. So I was telling him the other day, I said, you are the guy that all the Jordan Peterson followers want to be. They want to be this kind of person who can live out this disciplined lifestyle. And he says, well, habits eat, what is it? Habits eat, habits eat goals for breakfast or something like that. And they eat aspirations for lunch. So he says, you just have to build in these little habits and you, so that you're doing what needs to be done over and over and over again until it becomes such part of your life that you just do it. And that is the part that is just so hard for me too, because I get up in my head and I start thinking about something, and I have a list of things to do for the day, and I get started on one of them, and it draws me to something else and to something, and I keep going down these paths, little rabbit trails, but I mean, that's why there are many different kinds of people in the world, because I do find things on those trails that turn into something eventually and are useful.
Yeah. Kind of like what you started off the conversation off with was the idea that you would have a vision in your mind, and then you would work towards manifesting that. But then by the time you acquired the skills to manifest it, the vision was old. It was kind of stale, or you had a new vision. So it's always ahead in that sense. And
what that also means is that everything that I produce along the way is incomplete and isn't reaching its potential.
Yeah.
That's also where the energy is, right? The energy is in that incompleteness, and that's what drives us to keep getting more and more knowledge and more depth of understanding of the transcendent, and more learning to love more and more. All of those things that are incomplete is what draws us along to something more.
Yeah. There's a sense of seeking without finding, and an incompletion, and that ultimately, that we don't want that completion, because again, that would be death. Essentially, it would be perfection, and that would be the end of contrast, and the end of all energy and consciousness. So it's like this messy middle that we're in, and that I think that's what perked my ears up when I first heard you talking about your art process, Karen, because you were talking about how you would intentionally create some chaos on the canvas, and then what emerged from that, you would use that as sort of a nucleation for something to emerge. And that's different than having a vision in your mind that you're trying to match in reality. It's much more present than that. It lacks that delay. It's more looking at what is and molding it, like more like working with clay or sculpture or something like that, where you're allowing the material to tell you what it wants to be and what it is, and you don't have this vision at all, other than what your soul has a vision, but you don't. Your thoughts can't know that, and in a sense, that to me, that's a symbol is something that is created not with intention or vision, but it's something that has to emerge, and that we somehow have to observe it in order for it to emerge, where it's intimately part of us, but at the same time, it's not anything that we like can ever intend to do. It's more something created through us than by us.
That's a pretty deep insight into me, Alex, because because I one of the reasons I stopped doing strictly literal work was that I felt so incompetent at producing the level and the quality and the beauty that was in my head. And so I started developing this process over time of adding more and more chaos so that I could discover what was there and build something out of that. And so it was partly my own inadequacy and so forth that drove me to develop that method. And yet in developing that method, I learned so much more about myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ultimately I've ended up with artwork that's more interesting. And so that's been an interesting process for me. So it's interesting how you could see through me.
Well, I think that's because I do the same thing, except minus the skill part.
Uh-huh.
And yeah,
symbol too. It makes me think about all these things in the world that I see as symbols that kind of unfold for me, like a tree or a rock, or
yeah, like everything.
path, any of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Those are things that God put in the world to show us his transcendence. So those are symbols that he reveals to us. And probably it's the salience thing that you're talking about, Michael, that allows us to see those things instead of the overwhelming mass of information that's out there. There's so many things and information and everything else, but the things that will stand out to us as symbols that show us the transcendent, those are guides that he has given us, little hints of his nature and of his character.
I kind of think of the symbol having more to do with our perception than the thing, so that we could see. And I think Michael had said something about this in relation to maybe what Barfield had to say. I'm not sure, but to me, it's also a Jungian idea, that a way to develop a way of seeing symbolically. It's a mode of perception, so that if you're so inclined, and maybe there's some personality types that this is easier for, comes more natural to than others, but if you're so inclined, you can see everything, including yourself, as a symbol of itself, in a sense. Was that something that Barfield talked about?
He talked about I don't remember his language. He does use symbol. I'm trying to recall how it was either in I think a poetic diction where he gets into that, and I've been digging more into saving the appearances lately, which is I don't know that he mentioned symbol there, but it's funny that I feel like there is some connection there in terms of his language, but nothing specific that I can think of.
I look forward to reading some of Barfield. I've been reading more C.S. Lewis. I started reading Screw Tape Letters after you mentioned it, Michael, and I'm really enjoying that. It's really good.
Yeah. Screw Tape Letters digs deep into our hearts, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's pretty spot on.
That's very humbling.
Yeah. Well, I think that the varying personality types probably all see symbol of some sort, because mathematics is filled with symbols, and so mathematicians will often, if I think of symbol the way that Michael talked about it a couple of weeks ago, as a kind of a data compression device, where a big story is compressed down to a small piece of information that can unfold and open up, then there are a lot of mathematical formulas that are very much like data compression bits. I don't know what you call them, but so mathematicians probably think symbolically in terms of those kinds of things, or when they think of they're able to think in more than 4 dimensions, and they're able to think of the Platonic solids and all of that in many, they're able to think of solids in many dimensions, and stuff like that. So they're thinking symbolically, but it's just different kinds of symbols, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting how you hear some mathematicians talking about that math being the language of God, and in the sense of a sense or feeling of transcendence, when there's a beauty in the equation, the expression of nature through these symbols.
Any final words, Michael?
No, I think I've exhausted. I'm like, you guys have said so many interesting things. My brain's kind of like in a bunch of different places at once now, trying to piece it all together and make sense of it. But this was a really good conversation.
Cool. Well, if either one of you want to put together some of your thoughts after this and ship them over to me, I'll add them to the informational piece on the thing before I publish it. Good talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Karen. It's enjoyable.
Yeah. Have a great
Thanks, Karen.
Bye-bye.
Bye.